You will be shocked by what you hear. This is not just a story about betrayal. It's a story about how love can unravel, piece by piece, when the truth is buried too deep to ignore. I always thought the cracks in a marriage were supposed to be obvious. Arguments over money, infidelity, maybe a blowout fight about where to spend the holidays. But for me and Emily, it was never like that. Our life in Washington, D.C. was quiet, predictable even. No kids, by choice. Just us, a comfortable townhome near the Capitol, and careers we both worked too hard for. On paper, it looked good, maybe even great. But sometimes, what looks solid is just one storm away from crumbling. We'd been married for 10 years. A decade. You'd think by then you'd know someone better than you know yourself. But lately, I wasn't so sure. Emily was an environmental policy consultant. Sharp, meticulous, the kind of person who could out-argue anyone in the room without raising her voice. I'd fallen in love with her passion, the way she could make even the driest subjects sound like they mattered more than anything. But over the past year, something shifted. At first, it was small things. She started coming home later, always blaming client calls that ran long or unexpected meetings. Then there was her sudden obsession with alone time, something she'd never really needed before. She'd sit on the balcony for hours with a glass of wine and her phone, scrolling through who knows what, while I tried to shake off the feeling that I was intruding just by being there. I chalked it up to stress. Washington had that effect on people, the relentless grind of politics and deadlines. But deep down, a voice kept nagging at me. This isn't normal. Something's off. The trip to the Maldives was supposed to fix that. It had been my idea, a surprise anniversary gift after I landed a big promotion at work. I figured a week in paradise might help us reconnect, shake off whatever tension had been building between us. When I told her about it, her reaction was muted. Not exactly the enthusiasm I'd expected, but she agreed. "It sounds nice," she said with a soft smile. I convinced myself that was enough. The first 2 days on the island were picture-perfect. Crystal clear water, endless blue skies, cocktails served in coconuts. Emily seemed lighter, happier even. Like the woman I'd married was finally coming back to me. We laughed over dinner, held hands during sunset walks on the beach. I started to believe this trip might actually work. But then there was the dive. Emily had always wanted to try scuba diving. I'd booked a private lesson for just the two of us with a local instructor named Luca. He was in his early 40s, ruggedly handsome in a way that made me feel self-conscious about my office-softened physique. From the moment we met him, I couldn't help but notice the way Emily lit up around him. She asked him endless questions about the reefs, the fish, the currents, her voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in months. At first, I brushed it off. Luca was charming, sure, but he was our guide. That was his job. But as the lesson went on, I started to notice things. The way his hand lingered on hers a moment too long when he helped her adjust her mask. The way her laugh came a little too easily when he joked about how Americans couldn't handle real ocean currents. "All right, enough," I muttered under my breath as we surfaced from the water after a practice dive. Emily turned to me, her expression tight. "What's your problem?" "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "Just ready to get out of this suit." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't press it. Still, the mood had shifted. Dinner that night was tense, filled with strained conversation and long silences. I tried to bring up plans for the next day, a boat tour of nearby islands, but Emily just shrugged. "You decide," she said, her voice flat. That night, I lay awake in bed while she slept beside me, her back turned. For the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't really know the person I was lying next to. The next morning, I woke to the sound of waves crashing against the stilts of our overwater bungalow. Emily was already up, sitting on the edge of the deck with her feet dangling just above the water. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she was staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. "Morning," I said, stepping outside. The wooden planks felt cool under my bare feet. She turned, offering me a half-smile. "Hey." For a moment, I thought about asking her if everything was okay, but I stopped myself. Emily hated when I tried to fix things. She'd call me out for overthinking, accuse me of turning every minor issue into a full-blown analysis. So instead, I sat down next to her and let the silence stretch between us. "Do you want to do the boat tour today?" I asked after a while. She shrugged, still looking out at the water. "If you want to." Her indifference stung more than I cared to admit, but I nodded. "Sure, let's do it." The boat tour was as beautiful as advertised. Hidden lagoons, untouched beaches, dolphins that swam alongside the boat as if they were performing just for us. Emily smiled at all the right moments, took pictures, even leaned into me when I put my arm around her. But it all felt performative, like she was checking boxes instead of actually enjoying herself. When we got back to the resort that evening, I suggested we grab dinner at the beach bar. "You love those tiki torches," I said, trying to lighten the mood. She hesitated for just a second before nodding. "Okay, let me shower first." While she got ready, I sat on the deck with a beer, scrolling through my phone but not really reading anything. My mind kept circling back to the dive instructor, Luca. I hated how his name had lodged itself in my brain, how I could still hear his laugh, see the way he looked at Emily. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was nothing to worry about, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. At dinner, Emily seemed distracted. She kept glancing at her phone, which she placed face down on the table. It buzzed once, and she quickly flipped it over, muttering something about an email. "Work?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yeah," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It's your vacation, Em. You don't have to." "I know," she interrupted, a hint of irritation creeping into her voice. "Can we just not do this right now?" I raised my hands in mock surrender. "All right, forget I said anything." We ate in near silence after that, the sound of the waves filling the void between us. I tried to enjoy the food, the fresh seafood, the way the spices lingered on my tongue, but my appetite was gone. After dinner, Emily said she was tired and headed back to the bungalow. I stayed behind, ordering another drink at the bar. I told myself I just needed a few minutes to clear my head, but an hour later, I was still there, nursing my third whiskey and staring out at the dark ocean. When I finally decided to call it a night, I reached into my pocket and realized I'd left my wallet back in the bungalow. Swearing under my breath, I handed the bartender a room number and promised to settle up later. The walk back was short, but my head was buzzing, not just from the alcohol, but from everything that had been building over the past few days. I was halfway to our room when I saw them, Emily and Luca, standing near the edge of the pier. At first, I thought it might just be a coincidence. Maybe she'd run into him on her way back and was being polite. But then I saw the way they were standing, too close, her body angled toward him. His hand brushed her arm, and she didn't pull away. I froze, watching from the shadows as my world started to tilt. I stood there, hidden in the shadows of the palm trees lining the path to our bungalow, unable to move. My mind raced with excuses. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe. But the scene in front of me refused to align with those justifications. Emily and Luca stood close, too close, their conversation punctuated by quiet laughter. She reached up to adjust the strap of her dress, a casual motion, but his eyes followed her hand in a way that made my stomach twist. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Confronting them now would only make things worse. I needed to think, to figure out what this meant, if it meant anything at all. Emily turned toward the path leading to our bungalow, her silhouette briefly illuminated by the dim lights along the pier. I stepped back, pressing myself against the tree as she walked past, her pace unhurried. She didn't notice me. I stayed rooted in place, watching Luca for a moment longer. He lingered by the pier, hands on his hips, staring out at the water like he didn't have a care in the world. Finally, he turned and walked in the opposite direction, whistling softly. By the time I got back to the bungalow, Emily was already in bed. She was curled on her side, her back to me, her breathing slow and even. I stood in the doorway, staring at her for what felt like an eternity. Was she really asleep? Or was she just pretending? I wanted to shake her awake, to demand an explanation. But I didn't. Instead, I slipped into the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My mind was a storm of emotions. Anger, confusion, sadness, doubt. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together on the pier, their bodies angled toward each other, the intimate way they moved in sync. My heart ached with a weight I hadn't felt in years, a mix of betrayal and fear that maybe I'd lost her a long time ago, and I was only now realizing it. The next morning, Emily was back to her usual self, or at least the version of herself she'd been on this trip. Polite, detached, going through the motions. She asked if I wanted to get breakfast, her tone light, almost cheerful. I watched her as she sipped her coffee, her expression unreadable. Was she acting normal because there was nothing to hide? Or was this an attempt to cover her tracks? After breakfast, she suggested we spend the day exploring the island. I agreed, hoping the distraction might help clear my head. We hiked through lush jungle trails, stopping occasionally to take photos of waterfalls and brightly colored birds. For a while, it almost felt like old times, like we were a team again. But the image of her and Luca kept creeping back into my mind, tainting every moment. By late afternoon, we found ourselves at a secluded beach. The sand was impossibly white, the water so clear you could see fish darting around your feet. Emily spread out a towel and lay down, tilting her face toward the sun. I sat beside her, silent, my thoughts churning. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Did you see Luca last night?" I asked, my voice as casual as I could make it. Her eyes opened, but she didn't look at me. "What?" "Luca," I said, a little sharper this time. "I saw you talking to him by the pier." She sat up, brushing sand off her legs. "I ran into him on my way back. He was checking on the diving equipment." "Why?" Something about the way she said it, too smooth, too practiced, set me on edge. "It just seemed late," I said, my heart pounding. She sighed, shaking her head. "You're being ridiculous. He's the dive instructor, Jack. He works here. People run into each other." Her tone was dismissive, but there was an edge to it, like she was daring me to push further. I didn't. Instead, I let the conversation die, even though every instinct in me was screaming not to. That evening, she suggested we have dinner in the main dining room instead of the beach bar. I agreed, though I wasn't in the mood to be around other people. The room was filled with couples and families, all laughing and chatting over plates of fresh seafood. Emily seemed relaxed, almost cheerful, her laughter cutting through the low hum of conversation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all an act. After dinner, she said she wanted to walk along the beach for a while. I told her I was tired and headed back to the bungalow alone. The truth was, I didn't want to be with her. Not right now. I needed time to think, to sort through everything swirling in my head. I sat on the deck with a beer, staring out at the dark ocean, wondering how we'd gotten here. When I finally went inside, Emily still wasn't back. Emily didn't come back for another hour. When she finally walked in, her sandals in one hand and her dress dusted with sand, she seemed surprised to see me awake. "Hey," she said, her voice light. "I thought you'd be asleep." I looked at her for a moment, trying to decide if I should call her out or play along. "I couldn't sleep," I said finally, setting down my drink. "Did you enjoy your walk?" She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It was nice. Peaceful." I studied her face, searching for cracks in her calm exterior. There was nothing. No guilt, no hesitation. Just Emily, the same as always. And maybe that's what hurt the most. "Good," I said, standing. "I'm going to bed." She looked like she wanted to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. I walked past her into the bedroom and closed the door behind me. The next morning, I woke to an empty bed. Emily's side was cool, the sheets neatly folded back. I found her on the deck, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "What's going on, Em?" I asked, my voice low. She looked up, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "You've been distant," I said carefully. "For a while now. Not just on this trip, but before. And then last night." "Last night," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I saw you with Luca." I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I didn't want to bring it up, but it's been eating at me. Her expression shifted. Annoyance, maybe even anger. Jack, we've talked about this. I ran into him. That's it. You're making something out of nothing. I'm not so sure about that, I said, holding her gaze. I know what I saw. She set her mug down with a clink, her eyes narrowing. And what exactly did you see? Me talking to someone? Is that a crime now? Her defensiveness only fueled my suspicions. It wasn't just talking, Emily. You were. I was what? She snapped, standing. Go ahead, say it. Accuse me of whatever it is you've built up in your head. I stood too, my frustration boiling over. You're acting like I'm crazy, but you're the one sneaking around. Sneaking around? She repeated, laughing bitterly. God, you're unbelievable. We stared at each other, the anger between us crackling like a live wire. Finally, she shook her head and walked inside, slamming the door behind her. The rest of the day was a blur. We barely spoke, each of us retreating into our own space. Emily spent most of her time on the beach, while I wandered the island, trying to clear my head. But no matter where I went, the image of her and Luca on the pier followed me like a shadow. That evening, I went to the bar. I told myself it was just to unwind, to have a drink and maybe talk to someone who wasn't Emily. But deep down, I knew I was avoiding her, avoiding the mess we'd made of this trip and our marriage. The bar was crowded, filled with couples laughing and clinking glasses. I found a quiet corner and ordered a whiskey, letting the warmth of the alcohol dull the edge of my thoughts. I was on my second drink when I realized I'd forgotten my wallet. Swearing under my breath, I stood to leave, promising the bartender I'd be back to settle the bill. The walk to the bungalow was short, but as I turned the corner near the pier, I froze. There they were, Emily and Luca, standing close together in the same spot I'd seen them the night before. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them. She was smiling, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He leaned in, saying something I couldn't hear, and she laughed softly. For a moment, I thought about confronting them, about walking up and demanding an explanation. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked away, my chest tight, my hands trembling. By the time I reached the bungalow, I felt like I was going to explode. I paced the room, my mind racing. Was this just a misunderstanding? Or was it something more? When Emily finally came back, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting. Where were you? I asked, my voice calm but firm. She hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. I went for a walk, she said, her tone casual. Alone? She frowned. What is this, an interrogation? I just want the truth, Emily, I said, standing. I saw you with him, on the pier. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I thought I saw guilt flicker across her face. Jack, you're overreacting, she said, crossing her arms. We were just talking. Talking, I repeated, my voice hollow. That's all it was? Yes, she snapped. Why can't you just trust me? The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I don't know, I said finally. Maybe because you're giving me every reason not to. Emily stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line, her arms still crossed as if she were trying to shield herself from my accusations. This is ridiculous, she said after a moment. You're acting like a paranoid lunatic. Maybe I am, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But I know what I saw, and what I feel. Her eyes flashed with something. Anger, guilt, maybe both. What you feel, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. This isn't about feelings, Jack. This is about you not being able to handle the fact that I talked to someone, that I made a connection that wasn't about you for once. Made a connection? The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She sighed, rubbing her temples. I didn't mean it like that. Then how did you mean it, Emily? I asked, stepping closer. Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell doesn't look innocent. She looked away, her jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought she was going to deny it again, to spin some story that would make me doubt myself even more. But then she said something that stopped me cold. Do you even realize how lonely I've been? The words were quiet, almost a whisper, but they cut through me like a knife. Lonely? I repeated, my voice rising. Are you kidding me? I've been here, Emily. I've been with you. Every step of the way. Physically, maybe, she said, finally meeting my eyes. But emotionally? You checked out a long time ago. I stared at her, struggling to process what she was saying. That's not fair, I said, my voice shaking. I've been working my ass off to give us the life we wanted. The house, the vacations, everything. And you're telling me that's not enough? It's not about the stuff, Jack, she snapped. It's about you. About how you stopped seeing me. About how every conversation feels like a chore to you now. Like you're just waiting for me to finish so you can move on to the next thing. Her words landed like blows, each one harder than the last. Was she right? Had I really been that distant? I didn't realize. I started, but she cut me off. Of course you didn't, she said, her voice cracking. Because you don't listen. You never have. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. The room felt too small, the air too heavy. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the truth was, I didn't know what to say. Emily, I said finally, looking up at her, if you were so unhappy, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you give me a chance to fix it? Her expression softened for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we could still salvage this. But then she shook her head, and the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Because I wasn't sure I wanted it to be fixed, she said, her voice barely audible. The words hung between us, heavy and final. That night, she slept on the couch in the living area while I lay awake in the bed, staring at the ceiling. I kept replaying her words in my head, trying to make sense of them. Was this my fault? Had I really been so blind to her unhappiness? Or was this just an excuse, a way for her to justify whatever it was she was doing with Luca? By morning, I felt like a shell of myself. Emily was already up, dressed and sipping coffee on the deck like nothing had happened. I joined her, but neither of us spoke. The silence between us was louder than any argument we'd ever had. After breakfast, she suggested we spend the day apart. I think we both need some space, she said, not meeting my eyes. I agreed, even though the idea of leaving her alone made my stomach churn. I spent the day wandering the island, trying to distract myself with snorkeling and hiking, but my thoughts kept circling back to Emily. When I returned to the bungalow that evening, she wasn't there. Her sandals were gone, and the bed was untouched. A sinking feeling settled in my chest as I sat on the couch, waiting. It was nearly midnight when she walked in. Her hair was damp, her cheeks flushed, and she smelled faintly of salt water. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Out," she said simply, kicking off her sandals. "With him." The words were out before I could stop them. She froze, her back to me. For a moment, I thought she might deny it. But when she turned around, there was no point in pretending anymore. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "With him." Her words hit me like a hammer to the chest. "Yes, with him." She said it so plainly, as if she'd admitted to something trivial, like forgetting to turn off the lights before leaving the room. I stood there, frozen. The air seemed heavier, the room smaller, and my thoughts raced in a chaotic storm. "You were with him," I repeated, not as a question, but as an attempt to process what I'd just heard. Emily didn't look away. She didn't fidget or stumble over her words. "Yes," she said again, her voice quieter this time. The truth hung between us, unbearable and undeniable. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but all I could manage was, "Why?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Jack, I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did." "That's not an answer," I said, my voice sharper now. "You don't just fall into someone else's arms. There's always a choice." She flinched, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. But it passed quickly, replaced by the same detached calm she'd been wearing like armor. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said, crossing her arms. "I've been unhappy for a long time. You know that. And this is how you fix it?" I shot back, my voice rising. "By sneaking around with some guy you just met?" Her jaw tightened. "Don't make it sound like this was all about him." This is about us, Jack. Or what's left of us. Us? I laughed bitterly. Don't you dare make this about us. This is about you. Your choices, your lies. Emily's face hardened. You think this is just my fault? You think I woke up one day and decided to throw everything away? No, Jack. This started a long time ago, when you stopped caring. Stopped caring? I said, incredulous. I've spent the last 10 years trying to make you happy. I've done everything I could to give you the life you wanted. Exactly, she said, her voice sharp. You gave me the life you thought I wanted, but you never asked what I actually needed. I stared at her, stunned. And what? You needed him? Her silence was answer enough. The rest of the night passed in silence. Emily retreated to the deck, leaving me alone in the bedroom with my thoughts. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the waves outside doing nothing to calm the storm inside me. I kept replaying our conversation, dissecting her words, trying to find some hidden meaning that would make it all make sense. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. There was no fixing this. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. The next morning, Emily was already gone when I woke up. Her side of the bed was cold, and her suitcase was sitting by the door, packed and ready. I found her in the living area, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone like it was any other day. Leaving early? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, her expression neutral. I thought it would be better this way. I'll catch an earlier flight home. I nodded, the lump in my throat making it impossible to speak. I wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, but what was the point? She'd already made up her mind. She stood, smoothing out the wrinkles in her dress. Jack, I'm sorry for how this turned out. I really am, but I think we both know it's for the best. For the best, I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. She nodded, hesitating for just a moment before walking past me to grab her suitcase. I followed her to the door, watching as she stepped outside into the bright morning sun. Emily, I said, stopping her. She turned, her expression unreadable. I loved you, I said simply, even when it wasn't easy, even when it felt like you didn't love me back. I just want you to know that. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But then she blinked, and the moment was gone. I know, she said softly, and I'm sorry. With that, she walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway with nothing but the sound of the waves and the weight of everything we'd lost. I stood in the doorway long after she disappeared down the path. The silence in the bungalow was deafening, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to break something, but all I could do was stand there, rooted in place, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She was gone, and not just physically. Emily had been leaving me for months, maybe years, and I'd been too blind, too naive, to see it. Or maybe I just didn't want to. I closed the door and sat on the couch, staring at the suitcase she'd left behind. It wasn't her real luggage, of course, that was with her. This was just the metaphorical baggage, the weight of 10 years of marriage reduced to a neat pile of memories I didn't know what to do with. The day passed in a blur. I walked aimlessly around the island, avoiding places we'd been together. The restaurants, the beaches, even the pier. Every corner of this paradise now felt tainted, like it was mocking me for believing it could fix us. By sunset, I found myself at the bar. The same one I'd been at the night before, the same one where I'd left to grab my wallet and stumbled into the truth I'd been avoiding. I ordered a drink, something strong, and sat at the far end of the counter, away from the honeymooners and families that filled the space with their laughter. The bartender glanced at me a few times, probably wondering if I was okay, but he didn't ask. I appreciated that. As the hours passed, the bar began to empty, and the weight of my thoughts became too much to bear. I pulled out my phone, scrolling mindlessly through photos of Emily and me. There we were at our wedding, her smile bright and full of promise. There we were in New York, in Paris, at Christmas in front of the tree. Each photo felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of what we'd been and what we could never be again. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in those memories, but eventually, I became aware of someone standing nearby. I looked up to see an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the stool next to me. I shrugged. "It's a free country." He sat down, signaling the bartender for a drink. For a while, we didn't speak, just two strangers sharing the same space. But then he glanced at me and said, "You look like a man who's carrying the weight of the world." I let out a bitter laugh. "Something like that." "Want to talk about it?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not really." He nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "That's fair. Sometimes, though, it helps to get it out, even if it's just to a stranger you'll never see again." I hesitated, the words bubbling up inside me, desperate for release. And before I knew it, I was telling him everything. About Emily, about Luca, about the years of trying and failing to bridge the growing gap between us. When I finished, the man sat quietly for a moment, swirling his drink in his glass. "That's a tough one," he said finally. "Losing someone you love, even if they're still alive. It's one of the hardest things a person can go through." I nodded, staring at the counter. "I don't know what to do now. How do you come back from something like this?" He smiled faintly. "You don't come back. You move forward. And maybe, someday, you find someone who meets you in the middle instead of making you chase them." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. When I got back to the bungalow, it was empty, just as I'd left it. The bed was unmade, the coffee cups from that morning still sitting on the table. I sat down on the couch, staring out at the dark ocean. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to cry. Not just for Emily, but for the version of myself I'd lost along the way. The man who believed in love, in partnership, in forever. That man was gone now, and I wasn't sure if he was ever coming back. The morning of my departure arrived, and the bungalow felt even emptier than the night before. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed almost mocking, a stark contrast to the heaviness in my chest. Emily was gone, not just from the room, but from my life. And now, I had to figure out how to move forward. I packed my things slowly, each item feeling like another goodbye. The shirt she had once complimented, the book she'd brought on this trip and left behind. Even my shoes felt like relics of a life that no longer existed. On the way to the airport, I couldn't help but replay our last conversation in my head. Her words haunted me. I wasn't sure I wanted it to be fixed. There was no way to interpret that other than as a confession that she had given up long before I realized anything was wrong. At the small airport, I found myself standing in line behind a young couple. They couldn't have been older than 25. Their hands intertwined as they laughed about something only they understood. I envied their simplicity, their innocence. They hadn't yet learned what I now knew. Love is fragile, and if you're not careful, it can slip through your fingers before you even realize it's gone. The flight home was long, giving me far too much time to think. As the plane crossed time zones and oceans, I started to dissect the last 10 years of my life. Had I been so consumed by work that I missed the signs? Or was Emily right? Was this always destined to happen because we were fundamentally mismatched? The truth, I realized, was probably somewhere in the middle. By the time the plane touched down in Washington, I felt numb. I took a cab to the townhome we had shared, half expecting to see her car in the driveway, even though I knew she wasn't there. Inside, the house was quiet, the air stale from days of being unoccupied. Her absence was everywhere. In the empty space where her shoes used to sit by the door, in the silent hum of the kitchen where she'd make her morning coffee. Even the couch looked different without her throw blanket draped over the back. I wandered through the house, unsure of what to do with myself. My hand brushed against the picture frames on the mantel, each one a snapshot of the life we'd built together. Our wedding day, a trip to Napa Valley, Christmas in front of the tree. I couldn't bring myself to take them down, not yet. Over the next few weeks, I tried to settle into a routine. Work helped, giving me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. But the evenings were harder. I'd sit in the quiet of the house, haunted by memories I couldn't escape. One night, I decided to go through the closet. Her things were still there. Clothes, shoes, even a box of keepsakes she tucked away on the top shelf. I pulled it down, expecting to find old photos or letters, but instead, I found a journal. It felt wrong to open it, but curiosity won out. The entries were sparse, scattered across years, but they painted a picture of a woman I barely recognized. I don't know how to tell him I'm unhappy. Jack works so hard, but sometimes it feels like he doesn't see me anymore. Met someone today. He made me laugh in a way I haven't in years. I feel so guilty, but I can't help it. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I closed the journal and sat on the floor, clutching it to my chest as the weight of everything finally came crashing down. Months passed. I filed for divorce, and Emily didn't contest it. She sent me an email, cold and formal, asking if I could pack up her things so she could have them picked up. I did, boxing up the remnants of our life together and leaving them by the door. One evening, after work, I came home to find the boxes gone. She hadn't even knocked. That was the last time I heard from her. I wish I could say that I've moved on completely, that I've found peace or closure, or whatever it is people are supposed to find after something like this. But the truth is, I'm still figuring it out. Some days are better than others. I've started going to therapy, trying to untangle the mess of emotions that still linger. I've reconnected with old friends, thrown myself into work, and even taken up running, a hobby Emily always said I'd hate. But every so often, I catch myself thinking about her, about us, about what could have been if things had been different. Maybe someday, I'll stop wondering.